Narrative inquiry. It is a qualitative research method that focuses on stories and experiences of individuals or groups. It seeks to understand the meaning people attach to their experiences and the ways in which they make sense of the world around them. Now, whether we are talking about narrative inquiry or any other methodology, it's going to come back to what is your personal philosophy? What is your personal worldview when it comes to research? Because essentially, when you are selecting a methodology, you are combining your worldview with your intentions for the research. But if you don't know how you think and how you see the world, it gets a little bit confusing about which methodology to choose. The other piece here is if it's based on the researcher's understanding and worldview, so is the methodology itself, meaning whomever were the individuals who created or developed the methodology was also operating from a different worldview. Why am I saying this to you? Is because if you don't believe that stories can be an authentic form or a legitimate form of data, if you don't believe that storytelling can be utilized in research, then it would not make sense for you to utilize a methodology like narrative inquiry. It doesn't matter if a dissertation supervisor, faculty, whomever says that they want you to use it. If you, as the researcher, because in qualitative research, the researcher is the primary instrument. So if the primary instrument does not even believe in storytelling, then why are we using narrative inquiry? Now, let's move on. A little bit about history and background of narrative inquiry. It definitely has its roots in sociology, anthropology, psychology, education. So my humanities, my helping professional people, the philosophy of this is that stories are central to the human experience and that they provide a rich source of information about the ways in which people make sense of the world. So if you are trying to explore or examine or describe someone's lived experience, it may make sense to do that through story and storytelling because that is one of our primary ways of how we make sense of the world. Narrative inquiry recognizes that people experiences are shaped by their cultural, their social, and historical context, and that these experiences are important sources of knowledge. If you are someone who leans more towards the end of research should be objective and neutral, and we should strip away all of the outside influences and just get to the heart of the matter, then phenomenology may be a better option for you. And I'll be talking about that later. And I also have videos on my channel to talk about that. But if you are someone who's like, no, we cannot separate the individual from what is going on in their home environment, going on in their family, going on in the political, socio-political atmosphere of the world, meaning what's happening in their wider culture, like what are the laws, which political power is in office. Like if you believe that those very things are connected, then you would choose narrative over phenomenology. Another way of saying that is a lot of folks who are doing research, particularly from a social justice angle, or you are someone who is concerned with systemic oppression, then you are someone who believes that history, what happened in the past, how those systems were created, how those systems of oppression are enacted, you believe that that all has a relationship with whatever your participant is telling you about. So for example, if you are you're interested in the experiences of doctoral student, right? And you want to know what strategies they are utilizing to get them to the end of the process, like to graduate, finish a dissertation, right? If you are someone who is more on the spectrum in terms of your philosophy, in terms of your worldview, if you're someone who's more like, no, research needs to be objective and neutral, and we need to strip away any subjectivity, then you may just do interviews with doctoral students. You may ask them tell me about your doctoral experience and the strategies you use. In your analysis process, then you would be stripping away anything that they may have said about their race, their gender, about their perceptions of how they were treated in the program. It might not even occur to you to think about, oh, people of color were accepted in the school in the 50s or 60s or something like that, or Black people rather, 50s and 60s. Like, you may not even think that has anything to do with their experience now in 2023 at the time of recording this, right? Like, all of that you would strip away and just get to what are the basics, the essence of what it means to be a doctoral student who is navigating a program and getting to the end. That would be because your worldview says history, society has nothing to do with your experience. But if you're someone on the other end who's like, no, society has everything to do with that person's experience, whether they know it or not, you may talk to doctoral students and you may say, yes, tell me your story. But then when you go to analyze the data, you're going to bring in, okay, yes, it wasn't until the late 1950s, early 60s that Black students could come in. And so those participants who identify as Black, right, or who are Black, you would add that into your analysis. You may also add into the analysis of like, how is gender expression received in the program? What type of research are students able to do? How does that connect to legislation? Like, if you have some doctoral students in Florida, you may be really curious to know if they're doing any research around African American history or experiences. How has that legislation impacted their research, right? Like, you would want to add that into your analysis. This is not necessarily about a right or wrong. It comes down to you. What do you see? So if you're going to be using narrative inquiry, you're going to be listening to that person's story and you're going to be centralizing their story, how they said the story, and you're not going to be concerned with taking out any pieces that may have anything to do with subjectivity, because you may believe there is no subjectivity. Their story is their story, and we can utilize or we can analyze their story to get a better idea of what do doctoral students need in order to get to the end. That's just an example. I also want to say narrative inquiry didn't probably really get its legs or its lift, if you will, until the 1980s, 1990s. So when you put that into a span of time, relatively, like, we haven't had much time to really utilize these tools of research and ways of research in the same ways that we have other methodologies. So I do want to put that in mind of that might mean that, say you're a doctoral student, your supervisor, your chair, your advisor, whatever language you use, may not be on board with utilizing narrative inquiry as a methodology because they were not probably taught it, right? You got to think about time and when did they go through their program versus when are you going through your program. Even in the past 10 years, research has dramatically changed. Qualitative research has dramatically shifted. People are continuously adding in new philosophies, new ways of doing research. And so if this narrative inquiry really didn't start gaining popularity until the 80s or 90s, and your supervisor, your chair went through their program around the 90s, early 2000s, it's a good chance they may not even be aware of it. And so they may not even be utilizing it in their research. And so they may try to dissuade you from using narrative inquiry, and they may be pushing you towards a phenomenological study. Doesn't mean one is right or wrong. This is where it's important for you to do your work and your own understanding around research philosophies and what different methodologies are based in what philosophies. And I know I usually say don't read, but here's the thing. You're going to have to read the background of your methodology. You're going to have to really dig deep into the philosophy, at least if you're working with me. Because with clients, I'm like, I don't care what your chair told you about a methodology. You need to choose one and you need to be able to back it up. Because I'm not only thinking about their dissertation, but I'm thinking about, particularly for those clients who want to publish their research, a journal's going to ask, what's happening? What is this? And for you just to jump to saying, oh, I just did some interviews and call it a day, that's not going to fly. People they're not going to like that. Okay. I don't even have the words. When you're doing narrative inquiry, right, let me get into the actual process of how you utilize it. Number one, you're going to have to do some background research. So what is your purpose and your problem and your people that you're focusing on? Once you know that, we need to do some background, and we need to do some background on the cultural, social, and historical context of the participants, right? So if I go back to my example of studying the experiences of doctoral students, right, I'm going to want to do some some digging on how did doctoral programs come to be? Who were they originally intended for? How does that original intention compare to who is now enrolling and graduating from doctoral programs? The particular institution or institutions that I'll be working with, I might want to do some backgrounds of when did they start their doctoral studies. And for these, if I'm going to say I'm going to be looking at education leadership programs, I might want to know when did that program come to be? Who are the faculty? What were their intentions? Why? Because all of that is going to impact my participants' experience. All of that is going to show up in some form or fashion in the stories that they share about their experiences. And your job at the end, when you go to analyze it, is to do some connection building. So do some research. Number 2, when you are analyzing your data after you, let's just say you did some interviews, you interviewed 15 people, now you're sitting with the transcript. Once you go to analyze it, you want to consider those same cultural and social historical contexts when you're analyzing this. Here is where theoretical framework comes in, because most people just think you're supposed to just find a theoretical framework just for it to sit pretty. No, it does work in your research. And one of its main roles is when you go to analyze, you have something to anchor your analysis. You have a theory or a conceptual framework that is helping you to anchor the cultural, social, and historical context with the data that you have. So say I was going back to my study of the experience of doctoral students, I may have say I'm going to utilize critical race theory for my theoretical framework, and this is probably going to get me flack, but oh well. Say I was using critical race theory as my theoretical framework for the experiences of doctoral students. The cultural, social, and historical context is going to be living in the critical race theory, which talks about that racism is all around us. It's in the air, it's in the water, it's in every fabric of our country's being and our world's being, right? That it's a real thing. And that the main way that as a society we think about history or how history is taught is absence of the real, like the realities, the lived reality of racism. And that the master perception here or strategy here is that we should be making incremental changes towards a more equal society. But that will never get us there. And in fact, we're going to have to do some radical shit. And that we can't just look at people at this like one thing as a doctoral student, that we would also have to be looking at them and how all of their social identities, like their race, their gender, their sexuality, their socioeconomic status, their ability status, etc., how all those pieces fit in to influence their story about what it means to be a doctoral student, right? My theoretical framework is grounding that, and that means I'm taking more of an approach of all those things matter. Now, if I was someone on the other end who was like, nope, I'm objective and I am neutral in research, my theoretical framework might be Brenner's ecological model or something. I'm getting real nerdy on y'all, but if you hanging around me, you know what I'm talking about, right? I might just want to focus on how doctoral students' physical environment, their physical, like their social networks, how that influences their experiences as a doctoral student. Do you see how those become two different studies? This over here, I'm just thinking about their physical environment and their interpretation of their physical environment, just so I can get to what really is the essence of their experience and the strategies they utilize, which they may tell me something like, this is a new building. It has great windows. I always have somewhere to work. And so that has been really helpful for me getting to the end of my doctoral process. Whereas in this study over here, where I'm using critical race theory as my theoretical framework, I'm going to probably have results or findings that talk about, releasing other faculty of color helped me. Being able to do research about marginalized identities really spoke to me and got me through. See how those studies are two different. I'm still going to be asking them to share stories with me, but how I ask questions about their stories and how I analyze their stories matters, because it comes back to my philosophy and it comes back to the stated philosophy, which is rooted in my theoretical framework as well as my paradigm. Let me know if you want me to do a longer video on paradigms and worldviews. Let me know in the comments. I'll definitely do that. So let me go. Number 1, we need to do background research research before you start your narrative inquiry. Number two, you need to find a way to contextualize the data, which the best way to do that is to clearly identify your paradigm and your theoretical framework. Number three, use a reflexive approach. Both phenomenology and narrative inquiry has reflexivity built into it, and it just depends on how you approach this. Reflexivity just means a constant interrogation of your biases and your assumptions and how that is influencing the way you're interpreting the research. Now, just because I said over here, just because I said that, I believe that the cultural, the historical, the political pieces influences someone's story and that I'm interested in their story doesn't mean that I don't still do my due diligence of separating my understanding from my participants' understanding. I'm just not doing that because I'm trying to be neutral and think it's completely possible for me not to be subjective in this study. I'm doing that to be honest about how I see the world and how my participants see the world and how we might overlap and how we may disagree. I'm just naming that. But over here, if you're doing a more post-positivist, neutral, objective, there's a one truth type of philosophy or research, you're identifying your own biases and assumptions and subjectivity because you're trying to remove it completely from the research. But this goes back to beliefs. Are you someone who believes that you can remove your subjectivity? Or are you someone who's like, actually, no, I don't think you can ever do that? And of course, there are things in the middle. I'm not saying that it's only these two options. I'm just trying to make it simple for the sake of this video. You have to ask yourself, what do you believe? And throughout the process, to take a reflexive approach means to continuously be asking yourself that question through each stage of the research. Where am I showing up? Where am I taking over with my own understandings? I see this happen a lot with clients who don't really want to engage in analysis. They don't really want to think about their research. They just want to, okay, I conducted an interview, I'm done. Okay, let me just move on and write it up. And they haven't spent any time grappling with, what did I hear? What is the information coming in? How am I making sense of it? How are my participants making sense of it? What's the connection to the literature? What's the connection to the theoretical framework? When people don't want to do that work, this is when I'm like, because you're not doing a reflexive process. You just want to get done. You just want the end, and to each his own. But no. Qualitative research requires a reflexive approach. And like I said, let me know in the comments you want me to do another video, a longer video on that. Number 4, narrative inquiry requires you to engage with your participants. And doing so, when you engage with them, respectful, ethical, you're looking for ways to uncover even how does cultural and historical, or even how does oppression even show up in your study itself in the way that you design it. So this would require you to ask more open-ended questions. You may do more of a semi-structure or a unstructured interview or focus groups like that, because you're trying to leave the process open to see what emerges from the data. And because if we get into a place where we're doing close-ended questions, or we're trying to say, I can only ask these 10 questions to each participant, you may be missing critical information because you are the one researcher who's determining what questions we're going to ask. Built in that is the assumption that you are all knowing and that you know exactly what needs to be asked and you know exactly what your participants are going to say, because you are being so rigid in that I can only ask these 10 questions. But when you leave it more open-ended, unstructured, you're like, okay, I plan to ask everyone these 10 questions, but if we don't get to all 10 of them, it's fine. If we get to only 1 or 2 and they just have longer answers, whereas some people may get to all 10, that's going to provide a more richer amount of data. You're going to leave it more open-ended because things are going to pop up that you didn't even know to ask, that you probably didn't even think to ask. You would have never known to account for that because it's different from your own experience. It's different from your own lived experience, right? And so narrative inquiry asks you to be more open-minded. And that means for you as well as how you design the study. And it's also asking you to approach it from a place of curiosity and as much as possible to be non-judgmental, right? But that goes back to, where do you believe? What's your relationship to subjectivity? And then number 5, collaborating with your participant. Yes, we're going to engage with them and we're going to collaborate with them. Collaboration just means, did I accurately represent your experience when I wrote up my findings in my discussion? Did I accurately transcribe what you said? Did I accurately, when I got these findings and I put everyone everyone's stories together. Is that an accurate representation of how you see your study or how you told me to study? You can also collaborate with them throughout the entire research process. You could ask them to collaborate with you in analyzing. You can ask them to collaborate with you in writing up the final chapters or submitting manuscripts for publication or presenting with you or doing something for them, training them, right? We can get into many ways of how you can collaborate with them, but that is going to be important. I am going to leave it there for today. I would love to know, what are your questions about narrative inquiry, phenomenology, reflexivity, all the things. Let me know in the comments and I will record an answer. Keep going, y'all. Do your research, drink your water, mind your business. Okay, I'm done.